Welcome to 4 Quarter Lives, a podcast exploring the profound impact of longer, healthier, and more engaged lives, not only for ourselves and our couples, but also for companies and countries. I'm Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and on this week's 4 Quarter Lives, I talk with Michael and Nancy Hodin. Michael's the CEO and founder of the Global Coalition on Aging, and Nancy is a strategic advisor to them. I'm delighted to be joined by this remarkable duo. Together, they're redefining what it means to age with purpose and impact. Michael's dedicated his career to shaping global conversations on healthy aging and the opportunities within longer lifespan. Nancy, with her rich background in media and storytelling, brings creativity and a human touch to the narrative of aging. Together, they embody what I call third quarter duets, combining complementary skills to work together to create lasting change. In this conversation, we're going to discuss the global trends of longevity and depopulation and their profound implications for societies, economies, and individuals. We'll explore how businesses and policymakers are starting to adapt to these seismic shifts and why there's still so much more to be done. Nancy shares how her work on the Silver Economy Forum brings diverse voices from filmmakers to fashion experts into the dialogue on aging. From celebrating role models in the later stages of life to challenging ageism in industries ranging from healthcare to advertising, the Hodins are bridging the gap between policy, business, and culture in innovative ways. Grab a coffee or a glass of wine and listen up. So welcome Nancy and Michael Hodin to 4 Quarter Lives. Delighted to have you both.
We're delighted to be here, Avivah. Thank you for having us.
So I'm excited because this is a couple who's working together in their third quarters to work on all things longevity and aging. Michael, I'll start with you and just give us sort of the origins of what you're running called the Global Coalition on Aging, or the GCOA, which I know is part of your consulting business, but maybe you can share a bit of your background and what inspired you to start it.
Well, thank you, Avivah, and I too am delighted to be here and looking forward to the next few minutes of conversation. I had a long career at Pfizer. I was there for 30 years.
That's a good first career run, right? 30 years is a good first run.
I actually was invited to join them out of my political experience in my early 20s, working on Capitol Hill for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. They were looking for 6 or 8 young thinkers to create a kind of internal think tank. And I figured it was a good way to live in New York for a couple of years. I had been there before that as a graduate student, but go there. And so I figured a couple of years at Pfizer might be fun and interesting. But I met Nancy. We fell in love and got married and raised a family. So the 2 years at Pfizer, not least because
turned into 30.
Personal life,
happens.
30. At the beginning of the work at Pfizer, I would characterize the pharmaceutical sector as being understood as miracle makers. Most of society in America and certainly around the world as well, Europe, developed Asia, but everywhere, understood that biomedical innovation, from antibiotics to statins, for example, were responsible for what we now come to understand as our longevity. Sometime in about the mid-90s or so, when I had been there for pretty close to 20 years, we started noticing that the atmosphere was profoundly changing, where there was a critique against the industry because, well, yeah, sure, you have these new innovative medicines, but you're charging high prices and you have monopoly through patents.
Yeah.
And we started doing a lot of research around the world, particularly in Europe, and discovered that that was largely a result of health systems not being able to afford people who are living longer. Health systems like the UK, NHS, for example, was fine when it was created in 1947, but by 25 years later, and certainly by 40 years later, when we started recognizing longevity, the arithmetic didn't work.
Yep.
And we started hearing the word, particularly around Europe, of what we needed was a healthier aging. And so we did a huge amount of research into that and began to understand that there was this intersection between public policy, market innovation, and healthy aging, which perhaps could reframe how societies are beginning to look at innovation. And having done that for about 10 years then at Pfizer, I thought, well, maybe we can actually make a business out of this. And that became the Global Coalition on Aging.
Fantastic. Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. And a really deep-rooted network of global interests in the fact of it. That's fantastic.
And just the last point is the cornerstone of what became the Global Coalition on Aging was precisely that, to your point, you needed an array of diverse stakeholders, including the business community. So could we create something that included financial services and pharma and technology and transportation? Because we then began to understand that while health in many ways is at the center of this challenge we had seen for longevity in society, that it was affecting everything, including retirement and work and how we engage in our daily lives.
And we'll come back to the Global Coalition in just a moment. So let me get back to that. Nancy, you've had a long and fascinating career in media. I don't know if you match Michael's 30 years exactly in parallel, but what led you to focus your shift on aging and join your husband in what seems to be his first initiative?
So, like Michael, I've had a long and storied career. However, I've bounced around a lot more than he has, and he was in one place and I have not been, because I always considered myself an informer. I liked to find out information and share it with other people. And that's been my media career. I have not been involved in fictional programming. It's always been non-fictional program, things that interest me. So whether it was magazine shows or news content or fashion content, it was always something I wanted to share with other people. I had previously been involved in some health-related programming, which was of interest to me, on cardiovascular disease and menopause before people were talking about it. And so I've had that.
The reason people are talking about it, because of what you've done.
Well, thank you very much. I wish I had had a bigger impact. However, I used to have a nonprofit group called the Video Information Network, and I produced content that I wanted to find out more about. And I sent it up, this is how long ago it was, via satellite to the news directors across the country. And that's how I distributed my content. But similar to what you've been thinking about over the years, I've changed a lot. And here I am in my third quarter. So here I am thinking about what next to do. And I had been doing lots of different content. And I started to think about myself. And I started to think about my age. And I started to think about aging and health, but in a different way than the Global Coalition on Aging has thought about it. I really wanted to celebrate people that I knew, people that I had read about that weren't getting the airtime, if you will, of having to do with their accomplishments in their third quarter and sometimes in their fourth quarter.
Yep.
So I was really excited about doing that. And I started reading voraciously all about this. And I created a website and did all these things. And in parallel, Michael started thinking about aging. And I gave him all these books. I said, oh, you have to read this, you have to read that. And these are the things that are important. You know, luckily, he didn't listen to me 100% because we'd be nowhere right now. But truthfully, I'm a storyteller, and you can only get so far in life being a storyteller. And I think he has a really great handle on this issue in terms of making changes. So I think combining my storytelling with his ability to make changes has really been an important aspect of the Global Coalition on Aging. But that's sort of where I came from and how I evolved into this interest.
I love it because you guys are a wonderful model of what I call duets, is couples who actually in their second or later careers get together to share their kind of complementary skills and passions and do something. So I'm just curious, how do you balance? You've both had illustrious careers individually. How does it work to balance collaboration and independence? Do you enjoy it? Do you travel around? Like, are you together more than you used to be? What's it like a little bit?
Well, you want me to start?
Yeah,
I would say that we are together more, but for a number of reasons. Michael traveled, I would say, 6 months out of the year when he was at Pfizer. So we were not together in that aspect. And I was working on my own things and with the family and children and animals and everything else. So we were more separate then. How it works now, which is really great, is that through the Global Coalition on Aging, I have been given a gift of the Silver Economy Forum, and it allows me to be independent within this organization. So I have a
Tell us a bit about what that is.
So the Silver Economy Forum is an annual gathering that we started 5 years ago, and I was brought in to help execute the technical aspects of it, but during which I was also able to have a seat at the table and to give my views on what I thought was important, which generally was not necessarily something they were thinking about. So it was a gift for me. And I think I challenged everyone at the table to think outside the box when it comes to aging and people that you can bring into the conversation. So I think that's been great. As far as working together is concerned, you're absolutely correct. It is challenging. There's very little time where we are not talking about work.
Yeah.
And we're both horrible workaholics, and we work late in the evening and early in the morning. So there's
candlelit dinners are all about aging.
It really is. It's hard to find a break.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that everybody has something outside of work. You know, first of all, it feeds you, it keeps you healthy. And for me, it's always been about my family. I have had animals and dogs and horses and things like that have been a real focus outside, and volunteer work. So I think that that's critical when you work together.
Michael, what about you?
Well, your question is a great one. And I think there are a couple principal elements that have allowed us to do this, I think, with good balance. One is, I'll speak for myself, enormous respect for Nancy at multiple levels, but including both professionally and intellectually. And so with that, you can kind of go off in different directions and you can come back together. A little anecdote that kind of reflects it, which you've already alluded to. When I was deciding to leave Pfizer and create what became this new consultancy, the centerpiece for me of which was going to be around the aging of society. I wasn't sure initially exactly how or what. Yeah. I have two other partners. We now have a firm of about 40 people. It's a global operation. And one thing we said was, let's take a couple weeks off after I literally left Pfizer and before we were kind of rolling up our sleeves with the new firm. And also in parallel was starting a scholarship position at Council on Foreign Relations on population aging. So before that, Nancy and I said, okay, let's take a couple weeks and try to literally do nothing. And one of, I think, both of our favorite places, which we had taken the family to many times over the years and been with friends, is St. Bart's. Love the island. Beautiful, beautiful island. And Nancy, and this is about 15 years ago, so Nancy put about a dozen books on the aging topic in my suitcase. So I could start learning and reading, and most, if not all, she had already been through. So that kind of describes a relationship that is filled with both respect and intellectual and professional content. I read most of them. Of course, today would be a little easier because we would just put it on a Kindle or something, but then we still carried hard copies.
Yep. Wonderful. I love that image of your suitcase full of Nancy's recommendations. So, Michael, you often allude to two major pillars that you're looking at, longevity and depopulation. Can you elaborate a little on how these trends are reshaping societies and economies globally and how your firm addresses them?
Yes, and thank you for articulating it so perfectly. And the two actually have nothing to do with each other, frankly.
They're parallel phenomenons, as opposed
totally parallel.
Yep.
And, I think of it sometimes, the example of people saying, how would you, if you had a problem as you're flying, and how do you change, some mechanisms while you're flying, which is pretty tough. I mean, we have revolutionary transformation taking place globally in this quote unquote aging space.
Yep.
And it's built on and driven by these two parallel shifts. And both are profound and huge. And to deal with just one would be difficult enough. To deal with both simultaneously is what makes it so challenging, but also so interesting and fun, or intellectually fun. Longevity is that we're living longer for the first time in the history of humanity, where we have lives to 100 are becoming and will become the norm.
Yeah.
But certainly lives over 80 and into our 90s are even the norm today. But whether it's strategy and market plans from business or public policies in nations, the National Health Scheme is probably one of the best examples, although our Medicare in the United States or even Social Security in the United States are two other examples. Were built at a time when people died when they were 47 or 52 in general. We've always had old people, but
not many.
Millions.
Yes.
Right. And as we age, one hopes we will even solve this one, but today still, as we age, the risk of disease and challenge and difficulties of conditions explodes, from cardiovascular to diabetes to Alzheimer's. And so therefore, that's a huge pillar of transformation, but a great opportunity, because if we're living longer, how do we appreciate those longer lives in whatever individuals think of it for themselves? But the second pillar is that we've stopped making babies. We globally, the way we had, let's say, when certainly Nancy and me, and I'm assuming in many ways you were very young.
I had my two.
Yeah. But even I was born in 1951, and, the post-war baby boom.
Yep.
So the depopulation, and in many ways it's taking place globally, but it's even more of an impact on how we arrange, organize, and manage societies, particularly from a public policy point of view. So a national health scheme in the UK or a Medicare program in the US will be hard enough to manage, where you have 1 billion or more people, who are living longer, to have to take it to benefit from Medicare, let's say, not 1 billion, but, around the world, those kind of systems. When you have that where there's more old than young, which is transformational, and that too we've never seen before in the history of humanity, that becomes even a greater challenge. And Avivah, as you know quite well, this depopulation is taking place in every society on the planet as it modernizes.
Yep.
Whether you're in the Middle East, even, as people don't appreciate, across Africa and including sub-Saharan Africa.
Yep.
They are today still young, but they are getting older very, very rapidly.
And birth rates are falling even in Africa, which people don't really cotton on.
But in the developed countries of the OECD, across Europe, Japan, the United States, Canada, the birth rates are so low that the policy structures we have, or the business marketing plans that get developed against a different kind of population structure, not only are no longer relevant, but the arithmetic just doesn't add up.
Yeah, they're going to blow up. Yeah, completely unrealistic. So, Nancy, here we are. So lots and lots and lots of old people, fewer and fewer and disappearing young people. Your work on events like the silver economy, I'm so interested because that connection between those two dots that Michael just said, longevity and depopulation, are not often on the radar of a lot of leaders, particularly business leaders. And your work at the silver economy is really trying to highlight the intersection of policy and culture. Is it working? You've been on this now for 5 years. Is awareness growing? Are these dots being connected, do you feel?
So I do feel that it's being connected. And I feel that while there may be a very top-heavy view on this, which, as I said before, leads to really important policy changes and initiatives and papers that are being written, I'm sort of trying to do the bubble up, if you will. And something interesting came up to me this morning, actually, reading the paper, that in Brooklyn, the home of the Gen Z, or the people who are the youngest people in this metropolitan area, there is a brand brand new apartment building that's being opened that is focused on marketing to what they're calling a mature audience, people without children. Now, somebody said, what if I have a kid? What if I become pregnant when I'm there? It was like this.
Like if you have a dog in an apartment building, is that how they?
Well, it was really interesting that
more and more Gen Zers who are choosing not to have children.
Oh, exactly. So the market is evolving. So these are young people who are now pushing off their families, pushing for or not having children, and they don't want kids running around. The point being is that I'm sort of picking up on my radar all these interesting things that are happening in the world. So I do think that just having this article in the paper today is an important mark of a change in people's attitudes and that people are adjusting to this. Again, Silver Economy Forum for me is a gift. It's a gift for me professionally, intellectually, because it allows me to, if you will, bring in sort of that bottom-up approach. You know, I bring in my friends who are filmmakers, who have been in the media. I bring in people who are in the beauty industry, people who are in fashion, people who are in popular culture, and they're amazed at how much they don't know about things. And they leave thinking, I've got to do something more about it. It's not just about
because those sectors are pretty youth-focused and youth-addled, I would say. And so how do you make old sexy for these people who think that all cool are young?
You know,
I think that we are sexy. I think that
well, we would agree, but I think we're not the most. We've got to convince the young, right?
Exactly. And I think that was actually one of our goals last year. Our theme was aging for all ages. So this year we focused on leadership. Last year we said, and again, this was part of the gift I am able to bring to the table. Let's talk about the fact that you start to age when you're born. Right. And let's not, as our friend Ashton Applewhite would say, let's just nip this ageism in the butt here because it's just not working for anyone. It's not healthy. It's not working for us. It's so outdated and outmoded. So the idea is to get younger people to start to think about aging in a much more life course perspective, as opposed to, oh, damn, I'm 65. My hair's falling out. Like, why did this happen? I find a lot of people that I know are surprised that they're having changes in their lives at certain points in their lives. And I'm thinking, well, where have you been? What have you been thinking about? Did you think you'd be a kid forever?
They haven't been thinking. This is the stuff that hits you in the face, right? When you weren't thinking. So
I hope I am able to bring more, it's happening. I hope I'm able to push it even further.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's essential work. And I think, let me turn back to you, Michael, with the consulting company. You're working with a lot of companies and corporates, and you've emphasized that maybe they are a little fleeter of foot in adapting to governments. Actually, I think it seems to me that this topic has been much more present in governmental thinking than it has been in corporate thinking, but maybe you disagree. I'm really curious, what for you are the sort of best practice examples of companies who've really leading the way on some new thinking in this space? Who's innovating? Can you?
Yeah, so that is precisely the surprising and at the same time huge opportunity. When we created the Global Coalition on Aging, which is now about 13, 14 years ago, we had the idea that most people then, fewer today, I think, are looking at the number of older adults and the number of older adults versus younger population. Oh my God, there's all the old people. What are we going to do with them? And if that was the kind of general sentiment across society, which is still reflected in many quarters of society, it was even more dramatic in the business community.
Yeah.
And so what we've been trying to do is bring companies to this strategic insight, and we do it in many different ways. Silver Economy Forum is one of the ways that's happened. But if you're in a large global company or even a medium-sized international company and you're doing strategic planning, you're going to look at large demographic swaths and make strategic plans accordingly with respect to research for your pipeline of products and services, with respect to the marketing of your products and or services, et cetera. So, for example, the late 80s, early 90s, the wall comes down and suddenly you have another 500 million people in what was Eastern Europe, and that's a market that everyone wanted to get into.
Yeah.
Sometime in the 90s as well, maybe into 2000. Well, there's 1.2, 1.3 billion in China. We know we're not going to sell to everyone, but that's a market we have to get into. Same thing with India. There's close to 2 billion of us today on the planet over 50. It'll double over the next couple of decades. Think of that as a marketplace. That's not the way most corporations are currently thinking about it, but that is the way we strategically try to frame it.
Yes.
And Silver Economy Forum is a setting where we can have those kind of discussions. It's beginning to happen, but it's still far and few between. So, for example, I just saw a stat the other day that something like 2% of American advertising dollars are spent on people 55 plus. 2%.
I know, it's extraordinary.
Whereas 70% of the wealth are held by people 55 plus. Another stat related to that is 70% of America's disposable income are held by people 60 and over.
So that seems, those stats, when you present them to your corporate clients, it seems so unbelievable, right? It's slightly irrational. It reminds me of my work on women, right? Like, women make most buying decisions. Why don't you talk to them? We're in that same dynamic again. And I'm just curious, it's so obviously irrational. What's the response you get? And then does it lead to short-term shifts in ad spend and marketing focus?
We're getting some
examples.
Getting some changes and some shifts.
Yep.
A company that I think has been ahead of the curve and is benefiting as a result is Bank of America, who is actually one of the founders of Global Coalition on Aging. Through their retirement business, at the time, this goes back to the 2009 to 2010 period, right as we were coming out of the financial crisis when they bought Merrill Lynch.
Yep.
And the head of the retirement business at the time understood that there was this kind of demographic shift taking place that they should build into their strategic planning. So they started doing 2 or 3 things that were very interesting and, as I say, ahead of the curve. One, for example, they managed something like 80% of Americans' 401k plans. And so they started looking internally to see what they could do that then could apply to all of the corporate community for whom they were holding these 401k plans. They started shifting some of their resources from a pure focus on childcare, for example, still do it, to say, well, maybe we should have benefits for elder care. And they started doing that. And they started communicating that to corporate clients, from Walmart to Amazon to, Pfizer. Another example with Bank of America, they're the only company I know of, and I think the only bank, actually, the only financial service company that has an actual person who has a combination of financial and healthcare expertise. And they use that kind of expertise, and they have a group that does research and applies that to their strategic planning. One of the sectors that does a huge amount of work in this space, obviously, is pharma and healthcare, for all the obvious reasons. But even there, you get what Nancy alluded to a few minutes ago, this element of ageism that interferes with best planning and basically leaving dollars on the table. So let's say you're a cardiovascular health business and you're developing a product for heart failure, where the vast majority of your market, people that need it, are going to be over 65 and probably over 75 or 80. Nevertheless, if a 78-year-old Mrs. Smith starts feeling early symptoms of heart failure, maybe nauseous, maybe losing power, maybe needing to sleep a lot more, maybe feeling very weak, and she goes into her GP or even her gerontologist, and they will say to her, well, you're 78 years old. That's what happened when you come 78. No, you have early symptoms of heart failure. So there are many different areas like that where it's not just about the individual, but it's also about the market opportunity, where that individual then doesn't get the benefit of that product. The company doesn't get the benefit of the sales of that product. And you could take that through many different areas, even in the healthcare and pharma sector.
Yeah. Okay. So, listen, all kinds of opportunities, huge benefit for organizations if they choose to connect the dots that you guys are raising up in front of them, I hope, and I'm sure quite tantalizingly. 5 years into the Silver Economy Forum and 15 years into the Global Coalition, give me a picture of your next 5 years. When's the next forum? Maybe we can get some dates in our listeners' agenda for where and when the next one is. And plans, perspectives, hopes? Where are we headed? 2030 is kind of our new end game here. It should be a tipping point on lots of demographic data, I think.
I'll jump in and then let Nancy
us?
do it. So we are, as you alluded, in the middle of the decade of healthy aging.
Yep.
That was put together back in 2015, led at the time by Dr. John Beard, who was leading Aging and Life course at the WHO. He had a genius idea and put together a strategic plan on it. The WHO bought it. It then got shifted over to the UN. In 2021, we got the UN Decade of Healthy Aging. It got linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so we have a global kind of framework like we've never had before, that it's also becomes a way to communicate on this, to advocate, and to advance it. And so you're right that the next 5 years is a very interesting set of milestones. You're about 3 weeks early on exactly where our next Silver Economy Forum will be.
Okay, we're going to put it in the show notes when we publish. How's that sound?
But the interesting
thing for November next year, somewhere. November.
Because of we hope because of Silver Economy Forum itself, which has been raising awareness, because of the Decade of Healthy Aging, because of the increased recognition of the low birth rates, which is actually having a greater impact on society and therefore on how governments are looking at it. We're finding country after country is now sort of recognizing this phenomenon. The Saudis are all over the topic. The Saudi ambassador to the United Nations made a trip from New York to Berlin to be with us at Silver Economy Forum in Berlin. A few months back, we got an email from the mission of Uruguay to the United Nations. Their vice president is coming to New York for a meeting at the UN General Assembly. Could we have a briefing for them on what this animal, the silver economy, is? It's exploding all over Europe, of course, as you know. America, too, is now finding it. Nancy has a great set of ideas on what we should be doing over the next 3 to 5 years.
I think long term, I think this is something now that is so important. I'd like to have it be a piece of my legacy. I'd like to be able to say that my children, my daughters who are adults have a different world. They're thinking differently. Their opportunities are different than those that were presented to me at the beginning of my career. Yeah. So I think, 5 years, it may take longer than that, but I really think that this is something I want to push for on the long term. And I really do think that we have a different perspective on this. I think that the more people start to think about this, the more they'll put pressure on policymakers. And then the policymakers, like other changes that have happened, thank goodness, in this world, the policymakers will be like, ooh, I need to get voted in next year. I better figure out a way to satisfy this group of people talking about how we need to continue life, continue working, have opportunities, be independent, stay healthy. I do believe that. So when I find a movie that's being made about older people running a restaurant called Nona's in Brooklyn, I bring them to the Silver Economy Forum and say, it's not just about a movie. It's not just the fact that, people are going to be interested in seeing these actors and actresses. What you're saying is so vital that these older people have formed a community. They're helping a younger person find their way. It's so nurturing and nourishing. I want you to have a voice in this forum. So again, I'm all long term. I want this to be something that actually changes the way people think and then again pushes policy decisions in the positive way.
Thank you both so much. I love the combination that I've heard all the way through this conversation between the sort of big picture, policy-driven data side of this and then bringing in the popular culture and the storytelling to help people understand the shift that's taking place. I think it's a very powerful combination. So to all of your next steps, we will be watching and we'll communicate the dates of the next Longevity Forum next November in the show notes when you guys decide exactly.
Well, we hope that you'll be at the Silver Economy Forum.
I'm totally going to be there.
Because that's why I mentioned it was November, because we missed you this year. And we desperately want your voice to be part of that discussion and that conversation.
Thank you, guys.
So thank you, Avivah, for all the things that you're doing.
Back at you, and see you somewhere in November. Thanks for taking the time.
Hopefully before.
And hopefully before. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
For more thinking about the impact of our 4-quarter lives, you can read my column at Forbes and subscribe to my Elderberries newsletter on Substack. Let's design lives that aren't just longer, but better.